29 years before Everest was officially conquered, 2 men may have already done it. Then the clouds closed. No one saw them again. One of their bodies was found in 1999. The other, in 2024. Neither one answered the question. In 1924, 2 British climbers were spotted just below the summit of Mount Everest, going strong, close to the top. Then the clouds rolled in. Whether they made it remains one of mountaineering's oldest open questions. In the spring of 1924, no human being was known to have ever stood on the highest point on Earth. The 1924 British Mount Everest expedition, the third official British attempt, set out to change that, organized jointly by the Royal Geographical Society and the Alpine Club. At the center of it was George Mallory. 37 years old, a schoolteacher and a World War I veteran, Mallory was already one of England's most celebrated climbers, attempting Everest summit for the 3rd time in 3 years. He wasn't just a participant in this expedition. By 1924, he was close to a national figure, his name already tied to the mountain in the public imagination. A year earlier, a New York Times reporter had asked him a simple question: why did he want to climb Everest? Mallory's answer became one of the most quoted lines in the history of exploration. Because it's there. At his side was Sandy Irvine, an Oxford student, just 22 years old, chosen for the summit push despite having relatively little climbing experience. What Irvine did have was athletic ability and real mechanical skill with the expedition's experimental oxygen apparatus, equipment the team believed might make the difference between reaching the top and turning back. Before he left England, Mallory made his wife, Ruth, one promise. According to their daughter, Claire, Ruth told her that George had sworn he would carry a letter from her, along with her photograph, and bury them in the snow at the summit. Hold on to that detail. It matters later, because of what wasn't found. On June 8, 1924, Mallory and Irvine left their high camp, Camp 6, at roughly 26,800 feet, in the early morning, headed for the summit ridge. Before he left, George Mallory made his wife one promise: he'd carry her photograph to the top of the world, and leave it there. Whether he ever got the chance is a question that's outlived everyone who knew the answer. Below them on the mountain that day was a fellow expedition member named Noel Odell, a strong, experienced climber, moving up in a supporting role. At 12:50 in the afternoon, Odell witnessed something that would become one of the most famous sightings in mountaineering history. In his own words, recorded shortly afterward. At 12:50, there was a sudden clearing of the atmosphere, and the entire summit ridge and final peak of Everest were unveiled. My eyes became fixed on one tiny black spot silhouetted on a small snowcrest beneath a rock step in the ridge. The black spot moved. Another black spot became apparent and moved up the snow to join the other on the crest. The first then approached the great rock step and shortly emerged at the top, the second did likewise. Then the whole fascinating vision vanished, enveloped in cloud once more. Real quote, Odell's own published account, confirm exact edition/sourcing before using verbatim. By Odell's own reckoning, the 2 climbers were within about 800 vertical feet of the summit. Astonishingly close, if the sighting is accurate. And here's where a century of debate begins: which rock step did Odell actually see them climbing? The first step, difficult, but passable? Or the second step, a far more technical, far more dangerous obstacle, much closer to the top? The exact identification has never been resolved, and it matters enormously. Reaching the top of the second step would put Mallory and Irvine within genuine striking distance of the summit. This was the last time either man was seen alive. The next morning, Odell climbed cautiously back up to Camp 6. He found the tent battered by wind, their sleeping bags still inside, untouched since they'd left. There were no tracks leading downward. No sign of a struggle. Just a silent, wind-scoured ridge. Odell watched 2 tiny figures climb toward the top of the world, then vanish into cloud. The next morning, their tent was still standing. Their sleeping bags were still there. They simply never came back to use them. For 9 years, the mountain gave up nothing at all. Then, in 1933, climbers Percy Winharris and Eric Shipton found Irvine's ice axe, lying on a ridge at roughly 27,760 feet. Its position told searchers something important: the pair had climbed significantly higher than Camp 6 before something, a fall, a retreat, a collapse, stopped them. Still, no bodies. The mystery only deepened. Rumors circulated for decades, including unconfirmed claims that a Chinese expedition had quietly found and removed a body, and possibly a camera, sometime in the 1970s. Nothing was ever substantiated. But one of those rumors turned out to matter enormously. In 1975, a Chinese climber named Wang Hongbao reportedly told colleagues he'd found the body of an English dead man in old-fashioned clothing, high on the mountain. He died in an avalanche the following day, before he could specify exactly where. Decades later, researcher Johann Hemleb reviewed the historical record and used that fragment of a report to pinpoint a search area. That research became the foundation of the 1999 Mallory and Irvine research expedition, organized specifically to find Irvine's body, and to recover a camera that might hold photographic proof of a successful summit. On May 1, 1999, expedition member Conrad Anker made a discovery that stunned the mountaineering world. It wasn't Irvine. It was Mallory, found face down, much of his body remarkably well preserved by the cold, at roughly 27,000 feet. Verify precise elevation, commonly cited around 26,760 feet / 8,155 meters. What was found with him raised as many questions as it answered. A length of frayed rope was still tied around him. Most experts believe he'd been roped to Irvine when the two of them fell. His sun goggles were tucked into a pocket, not covering his eyes, a detail climbers still argue about today, since going without goggles in daylight risked snow blindness. Some take it as evidence the fatal fall happened in low light, or after dark, hours later in the day than a same-day summit and return would suggest. And then there was what wasn't there. The letter. The photograph of Ruth. The promise Mallory had made before he ever left England. None of it was found on his body. Odell never reported those items being left behind at Camp 6 either. Which leaves two possibilities, and no way to know which is true. Either the letter and photo were lost somewhere in the fall, or George Mallory kept his promise, and buried them exactly where he said he would, at the top of the world. No camera was found on Mallory's body in 1999 either, the one object that might have settled the entire question with a single roll of film. For 25 years after that, the trail went cold again. Then, in September 2024, everything changed, again. A National Geographic documentary team, led by climber and filmmaker Jimmy Chin, was descending the central Rongbuk Glacier below Everest's north face when they spotted something emerging from the ice, a boot, a sock, and a foot. Stitched into the sock, still legible after a century, the name A.C. Irvine. Jimmy Chin later described the moment plainly: it's the first real evidence of where Sandy actually ended up. Members of the Irvine family have volunteered DNA samples to formally confirm the identification. Irvine's great-niece and biographer, Julie Summers, called it the biggest development in the case since Mallory's body was found 25 years earlier, and said she's come to regard it as something close to closure, even without every answer. They didn't just find the bodies. Across 100 years, in two separate discoveries, they found the last physical trace of both men, and neither discovery has ever definitively answered the one question everyone actually wants answered. The myth versus the facts. For a century, popular imagination has quietly rewritten this story into something more certain than it actually is. In dramatized retellings, documentaries, and casual conversation, Mallory and Irvine are sometimes framed as though they probably did reach the top, the first men on Everest, decades before Hillary and Norgay, robbed only of the credit. Legend adjacent, not settled fact, that version is popular. It is not proven. Here's what the actual physical evidence supports, and what it doesn't. The 1933 ice axe and the 1999 discovery of Mallory's body both confirm the pair climbed well above their camp, genuinely high on the mountain, genuinely within range of the top. That part is solid. What isn't solid is the second step. This near-vertical rock barrier, close to the summit, is one of the most technically demanding sections of the entire climb, difficult even with modern equipment. Some experienced mountaineers who've studied the route argue it's implausible Mallory and Irvine could have climbed it with 1924-era gear and clothing. Others push back hard on that assumption. Conrad Anker himself, during the 1999 expedition, free-climbed the second step to test exactly this question, and demonstrated it was climbable, difficult, dangerous, but not impossible for a climber of Mallory's skill. The missing camera remains the case's most tantalizing open thread. Kodak vest pocket cameras of the type the expedition carried are known, under the right frozen conditions, to potentially still yield developable images even after a century in the ice, a real, scientifically plausible possibility, not just wishful thinking. But no camera has ever been recovered. Without it, there is no photograph, and without a photograph, there is no proof. And the letter, the promise to Ruth, remains genuinely unresolved. Its absence from Mallory's body is consistent with either explanation, a promise kept at the summit, or a promise lost somewhere in a fatal fall short of it. The evidence simply doesn't tell us which. Strip away the assumption that they probably summit, and what's left is more honest, and more difficult to sit with. Two men climbed higher on Everest than anyone before them, using equipment far more primitive than what climbers rely on today, and whether they crossed the final several hundred feet remains, on the actual evidence, a genuinely open question. Where the trail ends. Even after two major discoveries spanning 100 years, Mallory's body in 1999, Irvine's boot and partial remains in 2024, the central question of this case remains unanswered. Did George Mallory and Sandy Irvine reach the summit of Mount Everest 29 years before it was officially, verifiably done? Trail ends beat, no camera has ever been found. No summit photograph has ever surfaced. Formal mountaineering history still credits Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay with the first confirmed ascent, on May 29, 1953, and nothing recovered from the mountain in the century since has been enough to officially change that. What the record does now hold, thanks to 2024, is a small piece of Sandy Irvine himself, finally returned from the mountain that took him at 22, pending final confirmation through DNA testing that, as of this recording, remained ongoing. Verify this status before final recording. The mountain gave back two men, 100 years apart, in pieces. It never gave back the one thing that could have settled the argument. End.